Good morning, good afternoon. Before we start, please note that this event will be held in both English and Portuguese. Simultaneous interpretation is available. To enable it, please click in the interpretation icon and choose your language. Antes de começarmos, gostaria de informar que este evento
Before we begin, I'd like to inform you this event will take place in Portuguese and English with simultaneous interpretation available. In order to enable the feature, you have to click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and pick your language.
Bom dia a todos e todas.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to have you here in this webinar on the role of innovation in Brazil's clean energy transition, coordinated by the International Energy Agency, by the Ministry of Mines and Energy, and the Energy Research Company. My name is Camilo Ferraz from the Energy Research Company, and today I will be conducting the webinar.
Por gentileza, poderiam colocar a agenda?
Could you please open the schedule for our webinar on screen?
Bom, primeiramente gostaria de passar brevemente.
First of all, I'd like to go through our schedule. For opening, we have introductory remarks by Secretary of Helvio Guerra from MME, followed by two presentations, one about the Clean Energy Innovation Report by the IEA, which will be presented by Timur Goel, head of the Energy Technology Policy Division, followed by perspectives on long-term energy planning and innovation conducted by Mr. Tiago Barral from the EPE. In the second part of this webinar, we will have a discussion panel bringing the public and private perspectives with participation of 5 experts on the topic. Thank you, Agnes Costa, Rafaela Costa from Raizen, Renato Povia, and I would like you to submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'd like to start our work by giving the floor to MME Secretary Helvio Guerra. You have the floor now, Mr. Secretary. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can hear you. All right.
And thank you to all. Bom dia a todos e todas.
Good morning, everyone. It is a great honor to open this webinar on the role of innovation in Brazil's clean energy transition, and globally speaking also. This event is organized through a partnership between MME and other organizations. It is a great pleasure to participate in an event of this magnitude, and we also rely on the partnership with EPE. Brazil trails its own path in its energy transition process, and that is because our energy sources has always privileged renewable sources. And now, with a great potential for hydropower in Brazil, we can say that the energy transition and hydropower plants are part of our history and the history of power generation in Brazil. The first plant installed in Brazil was built in 1875, and we are talking about way longer than 100 years of using hydro energy in Brazil. Hydropower plants have been and remain being the key source for our energy sources to be one of the cleanest in the planet. approximately 60% of our energy is supplied by that kind of source, and it will remain that way. Our planning, including expansion in the National Energy Plan, makes it clear that hydropower participation will continue to grow in our country. The decennial expansion plan, looking at 2029, points out that within 10 years, over 80% of our energy in Brazil will be generated from renewable sources. But it's not only about hydropower. We also have wind power plants with over 16% of our energy mix looking at the 2029 perspective. We also have solar power plants and biomasses with over 10% of participation in the energy mix looking at 2029. This is no different when we look at a longer term planning, which is part of our national energy plan with a 30-year future perspective. Therefore, the 2050 plan. This plan presents a strategic perspective on a long term for the next 30 years, indicating trends and several alternative energy sources. This can be considered the beginning of a strategy planning where we map our challenges ahead of us in order to meet the demand of all sectors and promoting the national development. Both of these plans count on an important amount of studies developed by energy research organizations, including the EPE, represented by its president, Tiago Barral, who I have the pleasure to have with us, and Camila Ferraz, who's also participating on the event, representing the Energy Research Company. Our reality is of a country with a high percentage of renewable sources in its energy mix, and that imposes a great responsibility upon us to keep Brazil at the same level, to keep the bar level of renewable energy sources. And I'm referring to sustainability in its broader sense, whereas it's not enough to use renewable energy, but we must use the energy in a sustainable way. And for that matter, it is necessary to cause a change in consumers' behaviors also. And it's also important for governments to support this kind of development and to continue to innovate as Brazil has been doing over the past 50 years, especially with the current government, the current administration, and the current MME administration, who's been decisively supporting and fostering the development of our sector. For this webinar, we have a discussion on clean energy transition in Brazil, and this is one of the most current topics for us. Innovation stands for an essential action for us to increase efficiency, reducing cost, and increase productivity. That applies to all countries in the world, including a country such as Brazil, that albeit relies on 80% of renewable sources for its energy mix, must keep working towards innovation and must keep work towards modernizing its energy mix. Innovation must occur through clean energy sources such as solar and wind, and the environmental impact aspects must be looked into carefully, especially the intermittence nature of this kind of energy. We also have other technologies that can contribute to increase efficiency of these sources, and Brazil is keeping an eye on this, fostering innovation in energy production, and acknowledging we must adopt the best technologies available without giving up on competitiveness. There are examples of technology such as smart grid, Internet of Things, response for demand, and they integrate well with our energy plannings. Also, artificial intelligence algorithms can help us with planning ahead. With this webinar, we have this opportunity to gather different sectors and try to understand the opportunities and challenges, and there are many of them ahead of us. I hope this webinar, well, we hope and we are certain that this webinar will be very productive in that sense, considering the relevance of all organizations hereby represented and participating in the discussion. I really appreciate your effort organizing this event, especially the IEA and EPE and our MME team. I wish you all an excellent event and an excellent discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Secretary Guerra, for your remarks. I would like to continue our webinar by giving the floor to Dr. Timur Gul, head of the Energy Technology Policy Division, IEA, to conduct his presentation. Timur, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning, dear colleagues, Secretary Guerra, Mr. Barral from EPE. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today to speak about the importance of innovation for reaching our energy and climate goals. As an input to your domestic discussions in Brazil, a country that has a long history, arguably, as we just heard from Secretary Guerra, on using clean energy technologies from hydropower and various other renewables in the power sector to sugarcane ethanol in the transport sector. So a long history there, a country that is a esteemed member of the IEA family. So really looking forward to today's discussion here on clean energy innovation. In my intervention, I will draw on our latest energy technology perspective special report on clean energy innovation that was released in early July this year and is part of our revamping effort of our technology work here at the International Energy Agency. The background to this book or this particular report is, of course, the fact that many governments and companies are making and have been making and continue to be making very ambitious pledges for decarbonizing their energy sectors in the coming decades, to an extent that the objective is for many of the governments and companies to reach net zero emissions from their economies and from their energy sectors. From a technology point of view, there is a lot of reason to be hopeful on the achievement of such goals. We have seen great success stories in the recent past, from solar PV to on and offshore wind, more recently to cost declines that we have experienced for lithium-ion batteries for the use in electric cars in the transport sector. So a lot of good reason to be hopeful. But what we warn about with our report that we released in the beginning of July is that reaching net zero emissions will require much broader technology efforts that we have been seeing in the recent past. We need to tackle emissions from long distance transport. So for emissions from ships, planes, trucks and the likes, and to address the emissions from heavy industries, thinking here about cement, chemicals, or steel productions. For these sectors, we will need a whole range of additional technologies that will enable deep electrification of the energy sector. The use of carbon capture, utilization and storage for countries where this is important. The use of hydrogen and, of course, several forms of bioenergy. Many of these approaches have very complex value chains, and in many cases, the technologies involved will still need a significant additional innovation push. Now, obviously, talking about innovation today cannot be done as anything in energy. In fact, there is no conversation about innovation or energy more broadly that can ignore the fact that we have a global pandemic to deal with. There are two ways from the perspective of innovation to look at COVID-19. On the one hand, it's the most obvious kind of way of looking at it. There's COVID-19 could provide for a possible setback in innovation ambitions. It is clear that in many cases, in many governments, government budgets might be tight moving forward. So what will this mean for government R&D spending? And a survey that we carried out in the beginning of the year with many companies working in the technology space or in various other parts, different parts of the energy sector, showed that there is a possibility that these companies might also look into revisiting their R&D spending towards new and emerging technologies. This is one perspective on innovation. The other perspective on innovation is, of course, to remind all of ourselves on the important role that governments play for energy innovation, have played and will continue to play for clean energy innovation. It is in many ways, COVID-19 could also provide for an opportunity to revisit our R&D portfolios in the different countries and look at if they are aligned with our long-term visions for our energy sectors, in particular when it comes to reaching net zero emissions. Now, when you look at the point of departure, the reality today is that public energy R&D spending in technology areas that are key priorities for achieving net zero emissions goals is well below that of other areas. Today, when you look at public energy R&D spending, we are investing some $25 billion a year, of which 17 billion goes into applied research for specific technology areas. And when you look at the 17 billion in more detail and how it breaks down by various different technology areas, then we're seeing that almost half of the R&D spending to specific technology areas goes into low carbon power generation, such as renewables and nuclear. When you look at it from the perspective, what's the second largest contributor, then we find energy efficiency. Roughly 1/4 of all energy R&D spending from public sources into specific technology areas. Now, these are important areas, of course, there's no doubts about that. And we have seen great progress on the technology side of things in these particular areas, partly driven by this important R&D spending. But when you look at some of these important areas that I mentioned in the beginning, electrification, so the use of storage, batteries, etc., CCUS, bioenergy, hydrogen, then we're actually seeing that the spending in these areas is far lower than spending into power generation and energy efficiency R&D. Why is this a problem? Is it a problem in the first place? You might wonder. Why am I saying these technologies, in fact, are so critical for our clean energy future? So let's look at what an energy transition to net zero emissions for the entire energy sector, for the entire world, actually means in practice. Now, when you look at the emission savings that are required for reaching net zero emissions, everyone will think obviously about we need to address emissions from the power sector. Not every country is endowed with resources for hydropower, etc., as it is Brazil. And so the power sector today contributes to almost 40% of all energy and process-related CO2 emissions. So it's obvious that there is no pathway towards reaching net zero emissions without decarbonizing the global power sector as soon as possible. But what you also see here is that the emission savings required for net zero emissions cannot come from power generation alone. It's only 1/3 of the progress that would be required in order to reach net zero emissions in the long term moving forward. Similar story with electric cars. You will obviously know that many countries are pushing towards the use of electric cars in their countries, and obviously it is an important pillar for decarbonizing passenger transport, but in and by itself, it will not be enough to reach net zero emissions goals. The problem of energy is that the CO2 emissions are just coming from many, many more sources than power generation and passenger transport alone. They come from the planes we fly, the ships we use, the trucks that deliver our goods. They come from the various different industries that produce important materials for our daily lives, for our economies, cement to build roads and houses, steel to build bridges, cars, and chemicals to produce the packaging we need. So there are many different sources of emissions today, and if we want to reach net zero emissions in the long term, we will need to decarbonize all these sectors moving forward. For this to happen, we will need many, many more technologies than clean energy technologies than those that we've been using so far. The choice will depend on a variety of different factors. It will depend on the sectors, of course, right? Not every technology is suitable to decarbonize every single sector, and many things will obviously also depend on the local context. The current infrastructure that is in place in these countries, the resource availability from renewables to other type of resources. So there will be many different technologies that will be required. But as I said earlier, to decarbonize end-use sectors in particular, so transport, industry, and buildings, you will need to accelerate, we as a world need to accelerate progress on electrification, on the use of hydrogen and CCUS, and on bioenergy. Bioenergy here obviously is a very versatile opportunity. It has many, many different applications across the entire energy system, from the power sector to biofuels. I mentioned the case of Brazil here, of course, and the critical contribution that bioenergy can make will depend very much on how in different parts of the world sustainability of bioenergy use can be ensured moving forward. Now, why in all this? I mean, all these kind of names seem very familiar, right? We have been discussing bioenergy, CCS, hydrogen, electrification, renewables, etc., for many, many years. But so why are we so concerned about accelerating clean energy innovation? Let me try to visualize the importance of innovation for reaching net zero emissions in the long term. To reach net zero emissions, we basically, by and large, need to save 35 gigatons of CO2 emissions compared with baseline trends under existing and planned policies around the world. The contribution towards the CO2 emission savings that we need to achieve for reaching net zero emissions from technologies that are currently mature is relatively limited. It's just 1/4 of the CO2 emission savings that would be required from technologies such as hydropower, nuclear, and various others, which have already experienced a significant innovation boost over the last couple of decades. A very heavy burden in terms of the emission savings required would need to come from technologies that are currently at early stage of adoption. It's roughly 40% of all the emission savings for a net zero emissions pathway. What are these technologies that are currently at early stage of adoption? There are many different technologies involved here as a very broad category. Some technologies here are in their, if I may say so, advanced adolescence years, such as various different forms of renewable energies that have made it into the market over the last decade or two, such as electric cars, which are growing very significantly in many parts of the world and where costs of batteries have been declining. But there are also other technologies here which are just making their first infant steps, baby steps, if you want, into the energy market, such as hydrogen fuel cell cars. For all these technologies, innovation is still a critical enabler to make sure that costs continue to fall, and the way these technologies get integrated into energy markets is effective and efficient moving forward. The biggest problem, however, lies with technologies that are not yet commercially available, that are today at either demonstration or at large prototype stage. 1/3 of all the CO2 emission savings required to reach net zero emissions would need to come from these type of technologies. And these technologies are those that are required to decarbonize long distance transport, ships, trucks, planes, and they are required to decarbonize our various different heavy industries, such as cement, chemicals, or iron and steel production. What are these technologies? I'm thinking here about CO2 capture at cement plants, for example. It is about hydrogen-based steel making. It is about direct air capture. There are many, many technologies that are involved here. Also advanced battery chemistries are all very important technologies that would be required to reach net zero emissions and to decarbonize all these various different sectors. Just to say, this scenario here is our core low carbon pathway, the sustainable development scenario, which reaches for the world net zero emissions by the year 2070, obviously taking into account the various different country targets that have been announced. And it also involves all the targets that either governments or different corporate actors have announced in terms of their new and emerging technologies when they would come into the market. So when a company has announced my technology will come into the market in year X, we have taken this face value, and from there we have assumed the most rapid and aggressive innovation and deployment rates that we have seen in energy technology history. Now we need to acknowledge, of course, and we do acknowledge in our work, that there are several governments and industries that have pledged to reach net zero emissions earlier, sometimes as early as the year 2050. It's not a universally adopted goal, of course, but we did think through what achieving this goal through innovation would mean in practice. How feasible is it to achieve this goal through innovation first and foremost? Now, what does it mean reaching net zero emissions by the year 2050? It means two things, very simply. It first means we need to reach net zero emissions earlier, so 20 years earlier than in our sustainable development scenario. And the emission cuts that we need to achieve over the next 3 decades are substantially deeper, substantially. So what it requires from the innovation perspective is a further step change in terms of clean energy innovation ambitions. What it would require is, according to our analysis, that key technologies are available to the market on average within the next 6 years before beginning to be aggressively deployed, twice as fast as current announcements by governments and industries would actually suggest. It also would require, and you see this here in red highlighted on this particular slide, it would require that technologies that are currently only in small prototype or even at laboratory stage would become available very soon to the market before getting aggressively deployed, broadly helping to broaden our technology base that is available to decarbonize the energy sector. What this means in practice is that achieving net zero emissions by the year 2050 through innovation would not allow for any failure nor any hiccup in global innovation efforts. And just to give you a sense of what this means in practice, it would require an average of 2 new hydrogen-based steel plants to begin operating every month between now and 2050. It's a technology that is currently at prototype stage, or 90 new bioenergy plants that can capture and store their own CO2 emissions to be built every year until the year 2050. We have only one large-scale facility of this kind in operation worldwide today. Now, when it comes to innovation, there are many reasons why time is important. Time is important because of the pledges we have made for net zero emissions, but also because the energy sector, and here I'm talking in particular about heavy industries, is not able to absorb new clean energy technologies at any point in time. What do I mean? Let me explain this on the case of steel, cement, and chemicals production, which today are responsible for around 6 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year, which is roughly 1/6 of all energy and industry-related CO2 emissions. Many of these plants have been built only very recently, in particular in Asia. So they have a typical lifetime of around 30 to 40 years, depending on the sectors. And so it is safe to assume that under normal conditions, they will continue to be operating for many decades to come. The opportunity, but also the risk at the same time, comes with the fact that many of these plants need a refurbishment much before their typical lifetimes. The investment needs are of the order of building a brand new plant. The typical investment cycle is every 25 years, and many of the existing plants are running into this investment cycle over the next 10 to 15 years or so, which means that if key technologies, hydrogen, CCS, and others, are ready to be deployed at the market at scale, at the point in time where this investment cycle is coming up, then we can cut the emissions from these sectors much, much more quickly than we otherwise would under normal conditions. If this opportunity is being missed, then we will lock in another major investment cycle without taking into consideration clean energy technologies. Now, for helping governments to make their decisions on how to accelerate clean energy innovation, we did release with this report 2 important resources in my view. The first resource is a very comprehensive guide to clean energy technologies. It's a guide that maps out the level of maturity of around 400 clean energy technologies across the entire energy sector, including performance improvements targets, development initiatives, and key actors in each of these various different individual areas. This guide is available on our website for free, and I encourage everyone who is dealing with clean energy innovation to have a look. I think it's a very, very rich resource that we hope will be important for any R&D, RD&D decision maker around the world, and any practitioner, in fact, who is looking into priorities for accelerating clean energy innovation. And the second resource, if you want, that we made available with our report is our view on the 5 most important principles that can help fast track clean energy innovation. The first one is about prioritizing technology efforts in line with the stated goals. So having a long-term view on the energy sector, tracking development progress, continuously adjusting support as it is required over time, with a view to not leaving innovation entirely just to chance. Innovation is not a linear, straightforward process, but from a policy-making kind of perspective, you want to ensure that you're up to speed on the state of progress in each technology area. Second is about raising public R&D and spurring private innovation. Now, obviously, we acknowledge that R&D spending is not the only thing that will be required in order to accelerate clean energy innovation. It's a critical enabler, but just pouring money into R&D is not the only thing that helps to accelerate. but at the same time, without increasing our R&D funding, our ambitious pledges for decarbonizing our energy sector risk not to be fulfilled in the long term. The third key point that, or the key principle that we have identified is to think about the bigger picture. Don't look at your technology in isolation, but think about where it fits in the entire value chain of technologies that is involved. We have to acknowledge that the value chain, from the way we produce an energy carrier to the way we consume it, has various different parts along the value chain, and the value chain in itself is only just as strong as its weakest link. Fourth element is about building future-proof networks. Many of the technologies that we are talking about here, from hydrogen to CCS, electricity through smart grid technologies, all these will require enabling infrastructure, and governments have a critical role here, obviously, to reduce investment risks and facilitate coordinated efforts to build enabling infrastructure moving forward. And finally, is about international collaboration. This is a very big technology challenge that is ahead of us, and history has shown that innovation is fastest when actors from different parts of the energy sector and from different countries work together, sharing experiences, best practices, in order to make sure that the frontier is moved, or the technology frontier is moved in all regions as quickly as possible. We as the IEA, we of course stand ready to support governments, Brazil and others in their own endeavors through us as a secretariat, but also through our technology collaboration programs that seek to foster international collaboration on clean energy innovation. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and pass back to our chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timur. Great presentation and excellent work done by IEA. Após essa apresentação, passamos agora a palavra para o presidente.
After this presentation, we now give the floor to Tiago Barral, President of EPE, who will be talking about the role of energy planning on a long term in Brazil. Tiago, you have the floor. Thank you, Camila. First of all, I'd like to greet Secretary Elvio Guerra and congratulate him on his introductory words, and also my colleague Timur Güell, who's conducted this lovely presentation, bringing in a series of elements that I'd like to continue to explore in my discussion. I'd also like to thank all the panelists who are present here and everyone involved in organizing this webinar. I would like to start by drawing attention to the fact that Brazil stands out for having a greatly renewable energy mix, especially when compared to the greatest economies in the world. This was highlighted by Secretary Guerra in the beginning. And this puts Brazil as an important leader for energy innovation. However, this in and of itself is no guarantee for Brazil to successfully transition towards clean energy. These are elements that are part of the National Energy Plan for 2050. And I can say that the report produced by the IEA stresses this message. So if you allow me, I'd like to start by commenting on the 2050 National Energy Plan. As Secretary Guerra mentioned in the beginning, this plan for 2050 is the beginning of a strategy designed with a long-term perspective and an integrated approach of all energy sources, including interfaces between energy policies and other policies such as innovation, education, industrial policies, climate policies, among others. The 2050 plan, therefore, proposes to be a tool in reaching consensus and aligning the perspective of governments, companies, and society so that the energy markets are becoming more open and the uncertainties are getting more complex, such as the entire world. All the interactions are getting more complex. So the government alone cannot dictate the future of the energy sector. The government plays a key central role, but it must build this alignment with companies and their business strategies, their business plans, their priorities, their visions, and also civil society, consumers, the organized civil society, citizens in general. The National Energy Plan expresses the government's perspective, a perspective that we want to bring to discussion with society and the private sector so that we find more common ground in an assertive way towards the energy transition so as to boost the benefits to society and to the nation. The 2050 plan also brings in a methodological evolution, and that was something we learned over the years in the sense of having a humble perspective, a humble posture in light of uncertainties. We must acknowledge the uncertainties and to find the guidelines and tools that allow us to look at an array of options for energy sources and an array of options of policies and possibilities to build and pave a resilient, sturdy path towards decarbonization without losing sight of other goals in our strategy. The strategy for the 2050 plan has 4 pillars. One that has been mentioned about climate change and decarbonizing or neutralizing carbon emissions. And we have other 3 goals that must be put on the scale, which is energy security, competitiveness of the Brazilian industry and economy. Energy is an essential factor for competitiveness and also social and economic development. So we're looking at energy as a development factor. We must find a balance between these 4 pillars under this perspective on which the national plan was designed. And in that sense, the methodology was basically built upon 2 scenarios. One called the challenge of expansion, which means a pressure to expand energy offerings quickly. And on the other hand, we have a scenario which is the stall scenario, where we have the per capita demand freezing over time. The plan, therefore, aims at maximizing the benefits of the energy transition in Brazil without losing sight of all these uncertainties and variables, so that we can, within this context, design the market, regulations and policies, and above all, innovation as a key central factor to make that possible. One of the key messages in the 2050 plan is the role played by innovation because of the 2 powers that work in this context, which makes innovation essential. Decarbonizing, and the previous presentation stressed that very clearly, but also at the same time, economic competitiveness and the dispute for markets and for room in the economy. These 2 elements walk hand in hand in the energy transition. In the first case, with low carbon technologies tend to have the preference of consumers and public policies and funding. in terms of capital availability over the next few years. That's getting stronger and stronger. And in the second case of competitiveness, we must have technologies that allow for reducing costs, increase efficiency and productivity, and these will be key for companies to survive throughout that process.
And from this point on, as Timur presented clearly, the a set of technologies that need to be sped up so that we can make strides in decarbonization and remain competitive. In Brazil, with its universities, research institutes, and companies, is properly, perfectly able to be in, to play an active role in innovation, not only in innovation itself, but also by fostering markets that make it possible for this innovation to develop and to be disseminated. Some of these are clear in our 2050 plan. I'll just mention some of them. So, for instance, in industry, we have energy intensive segments that are very important in Brazil: steel making, cement, and other energy intensive segments like these. For them, there is the need of reducing specific consumption of energy, promoting efficiency gains, and also using technologies that lead to better management of their industrial processes. Digitization is a great help in this direction. And then another challenge, replacing fossil fuels in these industrial plants and processes. So the major choices are still high, the cost is still very high, and technology is not exactly mature to achieve this end. The cement industry, for instance, has a fair amount of emissions and is crucial for infrastructure and the building sector in this country. And also, there is no, the technology and solutions are not mature enough to make changes and renew and renovate this industry toward energy efficiency. And then the transport sector. Again, it is very clear that we have great opportunities for advanced biofuels and also airplanes, long distance shipping or ships in terms of fuels. Now, when you consider the production and handling and storing of hydrogen, hydrogen is or plays an essential role for the energy transition, being increasingly more promising. And Brazil has the skills and the capacity and capability of being not only a hydrogen exporter, but also to play an active role in the hydrogen chain generally. And finally, the electric power sector. There's also room for innovation there. Digitization of processes, AI or artificial intelligence for monitoring all the assets for energy generation, distribution, and also on the demand side, considering, of course, the social and economic gaps that we have in Brazil. In conclusion, in addition to highlighting the importance of innovation for us to reach our national energy policy, our 2050 National Energy Plan also stresses the importance of keep making strides in our strategies and guidelines to structure data basis for research and development on innovation to help design our energy policies, in particular clean energy policies, also for investment purposes, both in terms of public and private efforts, as well as international collaboration. So the recommendations and the insights that were presented by the IEA was only possible because there was data that made it possible for these conclusions to be reached, where the gaps are, where the bottlenecks are, everything that moves away from a consistent path to energy transition. And finally, making it all visible. What we can do in Brazil in terms of research is crucial for us to have the right tools so that these skills and capabilities are translated into high-tech added value markets and to maximize the benefits of energy transition to Brazil according to the National Energy Plan. So we want to be at the core of the energy strategy. So thank you again for your attention, and I invite everyone who wants to contribute to the plan, please be very welcome. And we want this to be one of the tools, in addition to the work of the IEA, in our energy transition efforts, and also to make the most of this transition to Brazil in the next few decades. Thank you very much. Thank you, Baral, for your considerations. This panel shows the views of the International Energy Agency, considering the scale of efforts that are required for innovation to play its role contributing in energy transition and long-term planning on this process. We will now start the second part of this webinar. It will be moderated by Gustavo Nassif, Superintendent of EPE. And this will provide both the public and the private sector views on Brazilian energy transition. I'd like to invite Agnes Costa, head of the Regulatory Advisory Office of the Ministry of Mining and Energy, then Eduardo Soriano, Mr. Eduardo Soriano, Director of Structuring Technologies, Ms. Rafaela Gomez, Head of Biomass and Renewables at Ryzen, with the private sector perspective, and then the CPFL, represented by Mr. Renato Pavia, Strategy and Innovation Director, and finally, Dr. Simon Bennett, who is co-author of the special report on clean energy innovation by the IEA. So Nassif, you have the floor. Thank you, Camila. Good morning and good afternoon for those who are in a different time zone. I'm Gustavo Nassif. I'm superintendent of energy and economic studies, sorry, at the EPE. So I'd like to welcome and acknowledge the presence of our audience and our speakers who have contributed their time for us to discuss such an important topic, innovation and energy transition. So this panel was designed for us to have this interaction between both the public and the private sectors in their respective perspectives. For me, it's a great challenge to moderate this panel. If we were to speak to each of these panelists or speakers alone, we could talk for much more than an hour. Our greatest challenge is to do this discussion in 1 hour. Oh, and of course, with such great experts talking to us. This panel will have an initial round of questions, which I'll be asking our speakers. And then we'll have a second round of questions based on the questions that the audience asks and writes in your Q&A section. So we will now start. And I'll start by asking a question to Agnes Costa, who plays a very active role at Ministry of Mining and Energy on energy transition, innovation, and the modernization of the electric sector, among many other topics. So I'll start by asking you a question to you, Agnes. And this is the discussion about energy transition entails energy and innovation, both. So, in this respect, integrating energy policies and innovation policies play a key role in this process. In December last year, the Minister of Mining and Energy and the Science and Technology and Innovation Minister, they both signed an interministerial ordinance to present a governance proposal focusing on research institutes and innovation, both in energy and innovation, or mining, sorry. And the importance of this governance and innovation are crucial in our national energy plan, as Secretary Elvio and Tiago Barral have both highlighted. My question to you, Agnes, is what have you been doing? What can you expect in terms of progress in this governance? Hello, Gustavo. Thank you for your question. I'd like to start by saying good morning to my fellow panelists. I feel honored to participate in this kind of discussion. We have our daily lives that are so busy, but these discussions on more structural issues are very important. It's a great challenge. And as Baral said, the opportunity of energy transition can be built based on this alignment. And I think the National Energy Plan is also about. So how can we discuss governance in our technology and innovation policy in both energy and mining? Because we are now speaking from the standpoint of the Ministry of Mining and Energy. So they're both important. We have also to focus on our mineral resources. So we were discussing the renovation of the electric sector. So there is a lot for development and innovation, also oil and gas. So I really enjoyed Timur's presentation. What we were looking at was the availability of resources and also the having track and adjust as a priority. In other words, see what is being done and also provide guidelines for the use of these resources, and also to harmonize results and adjust our trajectory, our path along the way. So maybe having a specific front on modernizing the electric sector. Last year, we worked for 180 days to map out the implementation of our sector reform in the energy or electric sector. So we had 14 different fronts, and governance was one of the fronts. It was ancillary, but it became more important because it's more associated with structural issues. In this respect, we came to the Ministry of Mining and Energy. Soriano is also here. We've worked together considerably. And last year in October, both ministers signed this ordinance with 45, 60 days to then bring up a proposal for, and this is very interesting. It's aligned to what has been discussed so far here. So we want to know what financial resources we have, but also when you look at the Ministry of Science and Technology, they also have the physical resources or the infrastructure, including research centers, researchers that need to be aligned to present to society at large what can be done in alignment with all these other policies on climate change, energy transition, when bring everyone to the same page and to maximize results.
So when we started to address that, we had a few initiatives going on because in Brazil, the policy for research and development in energy is about 20 years old. It's conducted by ANEEL, the energy agency in Brazil. So we know that in electricity, we've been generating a lot of knowledge. But furthermore, there are the resources coming from the research and development policies, so as to how to optimize these costs. But as Baral said, based on the initiative of which the IEA is also part of, the big push, we have to generate data. So we're thinking, how can we create a system of information collected so as to monitor and follow up on these developments? There's also an ongoing discussion about governance, about Brazil's international participation and international debate on technology innovation. The international agency has lots of events, and we are part of them, but sometimes we have there are events with a sum up of everything that's happening, and we see a world of knowledge, a myriad of it, and we talk about accelerating technological innovations, but we see that technology innovation requires a lot of investment and time. So when we look at what the IEA is doing, we look at it with good eyes, and we wish we could be more and more part of these discussions at an international level. In addition, as something that Baral mentioned, there's also the resources. We have the resources from sectors that are not strictly public. There is a public obligation that they must apply into research and development, but they're not public resources. And in no way is our intention to kill the innovation coming from the market. At the end, the market plays a key role in creating innovation, and the government does not to override that. But the idea is to monitor and to align expectations and strategies, especially towards directions that we see have most potential to bring a benefit to society as a whole. And like Baral said, it's not innovation just for the sake of innovation. We're talking about reducing social gaps and inequality. So the role of governments is to show that to the market where is the biggest potential of benefiting society as a whole. So we have a decree being composed that must be passed and published soon, and this governance structure gathers the two ministries to think strategically about these decisions and these topics that I raised here. But we're also thinking about a very similar structure where the Ministry of Science and Technology and the economy has. We want to create a commission where we bring in players from society, from academy, from companies to help the government, to help the state thinking about these strategies. What we have been doing clearly since 2019, and I think Baral emphasized that clearly, that new format of the National Energy Plan is about aligning expectations. It's about where we're standing as a society, as a government, and how can everybody contribute with a future that everybody wants to leave as a legacy for the country. I see this moment as very positive, and that is why I think Brazil must look at the opportunities that we have in the country. So I understand these events where we get aligned with one another are extremely important for us to look at where we're standing and how we can move on together. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Agnes. It's great to know that governance is making progress. And you also brought up the big push, which is a sort of interaction between the MME, the MCIT, and innovation, and EPE, CEPAL. So it was a very large project to structure the database for research and development in energy. And there must be an event to launch it in October 23rd. If you're watching us, I'd like you to save the date for the event, because we have discussions that are very complementary to this one, and IEA is also participating, because we must keep making progress, not only in terms of governance, but also in data. If we look at Timor presentation, the first thing is to prioritize, to know where you're going. And that is why the big push was so important. And I'd like to invite all our attendees and panelists to participate in our event on the 23rd. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Eduardo Soriano. Mr. Soriano, well, what we would like to know from you is where are we standing in terms of technology for energy transition? From a Ministry of Science and Technology perspective, what are the key opportunities for Brazil to be an innovative country and not just a technology importer? Because when we looked at Timmer's presentation, we saw there were several opportunities. In some fields, the country will end up importing technology, but there is plenty of ground for us to lead the energy transition in a few aspects. And I think that's what the Ministry of Science and Technology has been working on, and I'd like you to give your perspective on this. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Wonderful. First of all, thank you for EPIEA for inviting me to participate. And there are several different ways to answer that question. First of all, as of 2016, the ministry has been structuring and restructuring its science and technology system. In 2016, we have a regulatory landmark where we foster universities, companies, and government to work together. And another point, we are prioritizing investments in technologies that are key, that are enablers for adding value in the sector. These are the two key points. So from a technology standpoint, the ministry has recently released an ordinance prioritizing 5 technology areas, and 3 of them have a great impact on energy, which are the enablers for sustainable production. These enabling technologies are artificial intelligence, IoT, biotechnology. These are base technologies for us to be able to develop new applications, new products, new services. So they are not in and out themselves the result. They are the means for us to achieve those goals. Another thing are sustainable cities and renewable energy, bioeconomy, and so forth. And thirdly, we have telco. All of these play a great role in Brazil's energy sector. We were talking before about artificial intelligence and detecting failure, and self-healing systems and smart grids for energy systems, and the blockchain and cybersecurity technologies for operational transactions in the energy sector. We also have the strategic minerals and their applications in producing cutting-edge technologies such as permanent magnets and fast charge batteries. All of these are enabling technologies. Hydrogen as an energy vector, a power to X, which is a very important thing in Brazil. It's something it's a discussion that we are resuming, but power to X is a very hot topic now. And at this moment, we are working on a national policy and regulation for startups. We want to create the ideal ecosystem for companies to innovate. That's something we've been working really hard on. We have specific programs, for example, for technology basis to support startups. We have the Centelha or Spark in a rough translation program. And we have other specific programs that we could create. For example, a specific program for entrepreneurship in energy. We also provide direct support to companies via the Brazilian Innovation Company. We share resources, and we have the company getting contributing with 30%, the government contributing with 30%, and the agency contributing with 30% of this innovation. We rely on several mechanisms to foster innovation. So it's a large set of units that are specializing in energy innovation, especially the Center for Energy and Materials Technology in Rio de Janeiro. We also have very important tools to facilitate innovation that could be used by any company that declares its income. And oftentimes, these tools have not been used in full by the companies. We know that national or domestic companies tend to be more reactive than proactive when it comes to matters. They tend not to look for innovation as the key element, but that's been changing. So what the ministry is doing recently is such a as what Marcos Pontes minister said. We are creating a toolbox for innovation. And a toolbox that includes mechanisms and tools, but also to streamline the processes. And ultimately, in Brazil, we struggle with demonstrative projects that require lots of funds, lots of resources. And like Agnes said earlier, the opportunity to establish a partnership and governance between MME and IEA is important to create bigger projects to foster this innovation. But one point that we have been discussing in the ministry is that we must have more than just public funding. We must come up with new ways to attract other types of investment. For example, trust fund. So the ministry has created a specific secretary to think of new ways of obtaining funding, and that is very important. What we must do is to gather this research and development with the National Energy Agency and the money coming from the funds established by agencies, and the research fostering agency is also very important to provide us with resources, and the National Development Bank. So we must create a large project with big priorities. That is very important in our agenda. So to sum up, we are creating this toolbox specifically designed for energy, and perhaps we must customize it even further for the energy sector in a few specific aspects, because specific sectors have specific regulations or norms. So that's basically what I had to say.
Perfect, Soriano. Thank you so much. Yes, specificity of sectors is something that is very present in the energy sector. Even when you consider all the segments of the energy sector, well, there are many differences between them. And in fact, when we think of the previous questions, Brazil has great opportunities to lead global efforts in bioenergy. We can play an active role, not only in that area, but in many other areas. So as we are now discussing bioenergy, I'd like to invite Rafaela of Raizen. And those who are attending, you can ask questions. Please don't feel shy. Make your contributions, ask your questions. This is a great opportunity to ask questions to such reputable speakers. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in our Q&A section. So Rafaela, I have a question for you. In Timur's presentation, Timur talked about the relevance of the demonstration of great prototypes as well as pilot projects for us to reach more ambitious goals. Now, as the representative of a large biofuel company, how is innovation considered in Raizen's perspective and strategies? And how can you scale up the processes you invest in innovation and energy transition? Well, Gustavo, thank you for your question. I'd like to thank Tiago and Camila and the IEA team for inviting me. For me, it's an honor to participate in this panel to discuss such a significant topic for both Brazil and the world. I'd like to thank Secretary Guerra, as well as Timor and my friend Eduardo Soriano. Many of these, and also Agnes, you have already talked about many of the issues I should be mentioning. And my view is that, in line with what the other panelists said, energy transition is not an easy process. As we have seen with all the discussions and points raised by the IEA. One of the first things that spring to mind when we look at this challenge is that there's no easy or unique solution. And these are two very important considerations. So technology and innovation, they will be crucial, considering pre-existing technology that will speed up deployment of energy transition. But in addition, we need new technologies for the bottom of the curve. When we think about chemicals, steel, aviation, all the sectors that are today deprived of drop-in solutions, or at least in a commercial scale. So when you consider this challenge, what is required? Well, we need investment in energy efficiency, but also in new technologies, advanced biofuels, hydrogen, carbon capture storage, and other things that have already been mentioned. But then we have a problem. And Soriano said something that I really agree. Technology and innovation are just a tool. They're not an end in itself. They're just tools, very important and relevant tools for us to solve a problem. And when we look at the problem is that for some of these energy transition topics we are discussing today, when you consider, I mean, in companies, you just look at the market. In other words, for some cases, there is no commercially feasible solutions. In some other cases, there are such solutions, but there are no solutions commercially available for some of these markets. So we have the discussion on public policies, incentives, and also short-term processes for these technologies to develop. But then on the technology and tool side, investment is required, not only from the private sector, but also investment made by universities and the public sector, so that that investment leads to technology that makes that solution, a drop-in solution, possible. I'll give you a very simple example that everyone who lives in Brazil knows, and this is ethanol. The Brazilian ethanol car fleet is 70% a flex fuel fleet. It started in the 70s with the ethanol programs then. And today, when Brazilian drivers go to gas stations and they have the two options of both ethanol and either gasoline or ethanol, they may, the decision that they will make will based on economic considerations. And this is a success story because ethanol is viable today in Brazil, but it didn't start today. There was a lot of investment in engine technology production cost reductions of ethanol was another thing that happened. And today it's a feasible solution. The other example, solar energy. In the 70s, the cost of a megawatt hour of solar power was much higher than today. And today, solar power is now competitive. In other words, it competes with other energy sources. What do we want? We want to do the same thing for all the other markets or energy, like heavy transfer biofuels, biochemicals. All these other solutions, they will have to be adjusted and become economically competitive with fossil fuels. This is how we see this path ahead of us. At Ryzen, we have a great example, and this is cellulose ethanol. When we started, well, before I start, in fact, this is not something that can be done overnight. There is a long history of research of over 10 years. And then there's also tailoring and deployment for commercial scale. And Ryzen is one of the few companies that has a plant in operation on a commercial scale that does this. So in order for all these things to happen, you need a lot of things taking place before. So you have not only private technology efforts, but also public investment efforts, technology efforts. Tiago also mentioned that our plant that was built with investment by the BNDES, or Brazil's Social and Development Bank. So they provided a credit line. And also in Brazil, we have RenovaBuild, and we have RedTune in Europe, LCFS and Carbon in the United States. So these are paying for a premium price for these products. So for us to do business that is both sustainable and renewable, and that may replace fossil fuels in our energy mix, we need to do all these things so that in the future, we have the same situation as ethanol and solar power and wind power. This is how we should look at innovation, in my view. Okay, right. So keep working on the chain. As Soriano said, we should be able to get the tools to make all these or all this value chain or the whole energy chain progress made. So thank you, Rafaela. We will now change sectors. We were in biofuels. We will now discuss electric energy. And the electric power sector has its own challenges, which are not only technological, but also, and we should consider what Soriano said, there's another challenge, and this is the challenge of enabling technologies. Consumers playing a more active role, consumers and AI, consumers and big data, all these are enabling technologies, and they're very important. And then we have Renato Forvia, Director of Innovation at CPFL. So we have a very similar question to him, similar to what we asked Rafaela. How is innovation considered in an electric power company? And maybe could you give us some practical examples of investment that CPFL has been making to make energy transition possible? Renato, over to you. Thank you, Gustavo. Good morning, everyone, my fellow speakers. And also, well, for me, it's a great pleasure to be representing CPFL today. So first, you asked me about innovation and strategy. Well, we have two hats. We have innovation and strategy in the same department. We want to make sure that they're both aligned with a single future or perspective on the future. So I'll mention two things we're doing and then go deeper into your question. We have four major themes here at CPFL. We have first an innovation culture to engage everyone. And so we have a platform for all our employees to provide us with ideas. The electric power sector is really decentralized. So if someone has some idea, a simple idea that's not necessarily related to great technological innovation, it may be also of high value. So this is one thing. Then startups, that's the second pillar. We've had two rounds of discussions with startups and discussed with 24 startups in the electric sector. We have undergoing a lot of change as discussed here, and startups are much more dynamic. They're much better able to adjust fast with very different perspectives. And so we have this program. It's really satisfying to see how excited everyone is. It's really, it shines bright in our strategies. And finally, when we consider our innovation projects, for some of them, we get a lot of support from the Electric Energy Agency, again, with this focus on our future. So we have two major groups. What we have the operating efficiency group, so to improve our daily operations of pre-existing business. One example, and this is related to what was presented before. We have a predictive maintenance project based on big data. So without any CapEx, without any new sensors, we have now a startup that takes all the wind power monitoring data. They provide algorithms and say, this machine is close to its failure. And then we know it. And this can be replicated in any other initiatives. We use this from wind power to electric power plants. So we're now anticipating failure in many places. For an energy distributor, we have to anticipate climate change. Climate management is crucial for us. We need to monitor climate change. Anticipating a storm and managing the teams as the storm takes place for a corrective maintenance is also very important. So it starts with the weather forecast and ends up by sending teams to repair what needs repairing. So we're talking about high complex projects and a focus on operating improvement. And number 4, innovation with startups and operating excellence. Well, number 4, structuring projects. There's a whole set of projects for 2030, 2050, 2070, projects to prepare the company to work in this new environment. And this includes smart grids, monitoring of grids, electric mobility. This is also something we really believe in. And also projects aiming at electrifying the operating fleet of our company, CPFL, and one of the big companies. This is a major transition. We've mentioned going mature in technology. One thing is having an electric car for one passenger, which can, for example, recharge. You need infrastructure for recharging, but then you need an hour to recharge. So this may impact business. So we have a challenge to address this point.
As the key topic for our panel, I'd like to talk about storage technology, because we've been talking about renewable sources, complex consumption, and more devices on network. We have solar power generation and other sources, decentralized sources, which is no longer controlled by the company, and renewable energy, which has an intermittence issue, such as wind power, And solar power, when there's a cloud, the sky is overcast, we get zero energy from the sun, and the wind speeds change generation. So someone must be on top of all of this. And we must have the agencies monitoring this up close. And of course, we have a big portfolio. Brazil is a large country, and we have different sources in different regions, but oftentimes you must control it at a regional level. In the energy sector, we must have this, and we believe in the storage technology to help us with us. We have 3 projects for this. One of them is about placing a 1 megawatt battery in a 100 megawatt wind power plant, and its purpose is to control the output. That can, so we have a variation in production causing impacts on frequency and tension, voltage, other aspects of energy. When you add a battery, it helps controlling the output, and that's essential to allow for generating more wind power and solar power in our energy matrix, in our energy mix. The more we add wind and solar power, the more you must have devices to improve reliability of this system. Oftentimes we must turn on the coal plants, but that's not a vision for the future. We must have clean energy as alternative to intermittent energies. And we also have a project where we're placing a similar battery size in a distribution center. So we have a load curve that varies along across the day, and when you add a battery, instead of just increasing and expanding the plant, you can resort to the battery, which postpones investments and also controls loads for um, specific customers, specific consumers. And we have a third project which goes right against the topic of this discussion, which is a diesel generator that's receiving a battery attached to it. And we have been using the battery more and more instead of the diesel. We use diesel when there's a peak in consumption, when there's a surge rate, and little by little we add battery use. So we reduce the volume of diesel we use by using the battery charge, which is charged during the cheapest energy production moments, and we use it for output and the surge prices moments. And we have this transition happening, and as a part of the private sector, here's how we're looking at this transition. I loved Timmer's presentation because he showed the carbon emission reduction, and he showed the maturity level of energy of technologies, and he says there's a patch where we will have new technology that we are still unfamiliar with, and that only happens in a future scenario, because the challenge is not to invent the technology, but rather to make it feasible to be used. The chart was very intuitive to point that out, and I've mentioned a few examples. Storage, thinking about the technical benefits it provides us with. And to me, it's all about translating these technical benefits into economic benefits. And we require a whole framework, legal framework, to allow for that transition to take place. One of the factors is energy quality. When you have a wind power plant and you add a battery, the kind of energy you're providing is more continuous with a more controlled voltage, and that brings in a technical benefit for the system. But we don't have an economic model that comprises that kind of technology. I think the National Energy Agency is working hard on that topic so that we have private investors looking at this as a technical and economic benefit. Another important aspect of regulation and storage is the time of day. For example, if an agent has a battery, they can modulate prices more accurately, and they can use the battery to distribute the load, but that depends on regulation still. these are a few of the key elements I'd like to mention. We still have other ongoing work taking place at our company, but storage would be my key contribution. And once again, congratulations for this wonderful event. Thank you very much, Renato. Indeed, the sector is facing big challenges currently, and all these experiences you have shared with us are extremely relevant. And I'd like to, since you brought it up, I'd like to ask a question to Simon. Simon Bennett is one of the co-authors of the energy report, and the study covers regulation challenges for innovation. So I'd like to ask Simon if actually, what does the study say about innovation and how much the regulations can enable innovation and help fostering innovation?
Thank you, Gustavo, and good morning to everybody. And thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel, and in particular for arranging for interpretation, because otherwise this would have been a very embarrassing experience for me. It's a great question to ask about the regulatory side, because when it comes to innovation policy, I think as we've learned through this discussion today, it's actually quite a complex topic with a lot of different moving parts. So we tried to look into it a bit in the report. And if I just pick up from what Timo was saying in his presentation, because I think it helps to set the stage nicely. And what we said in the report was to quantify using some modeling that new clean energy technologies are crucial if we're going to meet our climate goals. But more than that, we have an urgency in order to bring them to market as quickly as possible. And when we talk about these issues, we're often talking mostly about climate, but as we all know, innovation is crucial for economic growth, for competitiveness, and for development as well. So right now we have these twin urgencies of getting the economy motoring and also tackling climate change. And this, I think, puts some extra pressure on policymakers to try to motivate and support technology innovation in the most efficient way possible. Innovation is often uncertain, but by learning from best practices, we at the IEA believe that we can try to maximize the chances of success and bring forward the technologies that we need as quickly as possible. And if national governments see that there is national technology available to be deployed, I think it makes the whole process of policy making much easier. Put in place support policies to deploy local technologies, and you can see that you have these positive feedbacks around wealth creation. So I think that frames the policy incentives quite nicely. And the discussion that we've already had here today, I think takes what in a sense is in some ways a negative IEA message about, we don't have the technologies, we're not spending enough on R&D, we have an urgent problem. And you've really, through this discussion, presented a very optimistic outlook, I think, of what's happening in Brazil in terms of the focus on new governance structures, some very concrete examples of technologies on storage, on hydrogen, on digital and bio, which present an optimistic message. The new tools that are going to bring startups and entrepreneurs into the mix. So on that basis, it's not easy for me to add a huge amount, but I will say that the IEA, in addition to the work we did on this report on clean energy innovation, we have a program that's called the Clean Energy Transitions Program. And through that, we're working with governments around the world on specific energy transition challenges. And one of those is innovation. And we've engaged through the Big Push project that you mentioned earlier with Brazil. We've been engaging with other countries. And what we see actually on the topic of technology innovation is that no one country appears to have all of the solutions or the perfect basket of policies in place. And so we think there's a significant opportunity for sharing best practices, and it's a role that we are very happy to play in saying, actually, innovation policy, for example, is broader than R&D funding alone. Brazil has a great deal of experience in raising the level of R&D funding through a very unique regulation, as I'm sure all of the audience is aware of. But the experiences of actually translating that funding into new products, new technologies, and impacts on the market covers a much wider suite of issues, and it covers the management of intellectual property. It covers how do the markets themselves support and reward new technologies and new entrants into the market. How does the social system around new technologies support or discourage these technologies? And in the report that we produced, we set out a number of pillars that policy can cover and that would be appropriate for tackling through regulation. And I think that the work that we're doing with governments is highlighting that actually there are different approaches to each of these pillars that different institutions can learn from, and different ways that, for example, a Ministry of Science and Technology and a Ministry of Energy can coordinate their objectives and align their objectives together. So that's one of the areas that we're working from. We hope to continue to engage with Brazil on some of these topics. Another one is, I think it was mentioned earlier, just the importance of the private sector in investing and bringing forward new technologies. We've done some work on quantifying the amount of spending from the public and private sectors. In 2019, we estimated that there was about $90 billion of private sector investment in energy R&D, compared to around 30 billion from the public sector. So there's a lot of activity in the private sector, but what types of policies actually create the incentives for the private sector to invest alongside government? And that's a study that we're hoping to conduct and look at, and we'd be very happy to engage Brazilian stakeholders in that discussion further. Other than that, I would really refer the audience and the panelists to our 5 principles that Timo set out earlier. One of the key ones for emerging economies, and let's not forget that as we look to the future, the modeling that we do over the next 20, 30 years, most of the growth in energy demand is going to come not from the advanced economies, but from developing and emerging economies. They have specific climates, they have specific economic context, infrastructure needs that will require technologies to be adapted or developed for those regions. And so there is a need for technologies that will speak to the needs of these countries. And within the countries, we think that this process of how do you prioritize which point in the value chain you'd like to target as a developer of equipment, as an exporter of intermediate products, these types of questions are going to be crucial. And we're moving, in a sense, from an energy system which traditionally was based on large technologies and local infrastructure, to one where the intermediate products, the mass manufactured solar panels, batteries, electrolyzers, and other devices are much more tradable and can access much steeper learning curves. So we're actually, across the world, governments are trying to kind of work out what are the new models of innovation support that meet the new landscape, both geographically, as I mentioned, but also technologically, because we're in a changing environment. But my impression is that the discussions in Brazil are really, also in a changing environmental position in your policy context. This is a great moment to be having this discussion. I'm very pleased to be here. I'd just like to also mention that the IEA tomorrow is going to be hosting
Também
a ministerial
gostaria de dizer
meeting
que
with
amanhã a Agência
OLADE,
Internacional de
the
Energia
Latin
vai fazer
American
encontro
Energy
com
Organization, Energy
ministros e
Agency, and
organizações
the Minister from MME will be
de
speaking, and there will be
energia.
a focus on
O
innovation
ministro
in
Minas
the
e
power
Energia
sector in
falará
particular. So there's a little
e haverá
advert for an
foco na
additional
inovação
discussion
no
to follow on
setor
from this one.
energético, ou seja,
Thank you.
mais discussões que serão realizadas também.
Muito obrigado, Simon. É sempre bom ver a opinião da agência no tema.
Thank you, Simon. It's great to see the opinion of the agency with very important opinions. Now, we can start the second round of questions. I'll be choosing some questions asked by our audience, and I'll try to go around the panelists. Feel free if you want to add something to what other speaker may be saying. The first question, I think this is directed to Agnes, asked by Antonio Carvalho, who said that you highlighted the importance of mining in energy issues, and that the Getúlio Vargas Foundations under the aegis of the minister has held many webinars. And his question was, how can Brazil's federal government see the global supply chain of minerals and batteries for electric cars? Because this demand is expected to grow exponentially, not only for cars, but also for trucks and maybe very soon for ships. How can you provide support to the private sector for it to be integrated into this chain? Thank you, Gustavo, for your question. That's a great question. If we think about the situation 10, 15 years ago, when we were discussing the mining framework at the ministry, we wanted to know how we could add value to Brazil's minerals. And this is also related to what Simon said. In other words, what is our role in the global supply chain? At the ministry, we are fully aware of the role of these new minerals for the energy transition. What have we been doing? We are now planning to add to this discussion without missing any opportunities. On the other hand, when we discuss electric mobility, there's something else we should be discussing, and this is important for Brazil. We have a whole history of biofuels, and electric cars may, of course, provide for the needs of a Brazilian specific niche in Brazil, but also when you consider energy intensity for producing batteries and then also alternative technologies. I recently attended another webinar on innovation, and there was a representative of Copal. They say how much they have to pay in R&D to develop other batteries, including sodium, something completely different, to provide more alternatives. So our duty, I believe, is to have everything on the same page. In other words, look at all these possibilities. And minerals are part and parcel of this strategy. Also, R&D, research institutions, and alternative sources of energy. So following up international debate makes a lot of sense. It's extremely relevant. And we have to see what each country is doing in their energy transition processes and whatever is available all over the world. In my opinion, Brazil has a particular dilemma. We have an overabundance of natural resources. So how can we fit us in when we look at our markets? Now, striving to get economic efficiency, but also respecting the environment. Antonio's question was very interesting because when we look at mining as part of the energy sector, we should be able to look at minerals as part of our strategy. Can I add something to this, Gustavo, to what Agnes said, if you allow me to? I really agree with what you've just said. First, and this is something I mentioned last week, but Brazil has many features. Brazil has huge dimensions. We're a very large country, and we have our identity, and this includes many different identities in every region, every city, every location in Brazil. There are different features and a different set of challenges for energy transition. That's number one. Number two, what you've just mentioned, we have an overabundance of natural resources, of biomass. As a large agricultural country, and then biogas, bioenergy, and even when we consider what Renato said, the caseload and intermittent, we have solutions. In ethanol, 50% of our transportation mix or fleet is based on ethanol. There's one more thing no one mentions. In our consumer market in Brazil, in addition to being a consumer market, having both energy, electric energy and energy as a whole, Brazilians tend to be early adopters, especially in digitized products. Brazil is one of the countries with the largest number of cell phones per inhabitant. In fact, it may be a contradiction, as part of our population, part of our people are still in the lower income brackets. But we have a large market of early adapter, especially in the digitized sector, digital sector. And then we have knowledge produced in-house or domestically in Brazil. We do produce knowledge. When you consider the number of papers published by our researchers, we have a lot of papers, a lot of researchers. We rank as well at the top of the number of papers published. Now, our challenge is to translate that into practical innovation applications. Lastly, I believe that, well, first, we are huge. We are highly diverse and highly complex. As a result, we are the perfect place for testing out energy transition solutions. Few other countries have this opportunity. I may try electrification for mobility in one place in Brazil. In some other place, I may test out biomass fueled plants. So we have many specificities. Brazil may become a great lab for testing out many different technologies and then define which one is the best or makes the most sense for us. And then in conclusion, this is something that's very close to my heart, this opinion I'm just saying. We should understand what's going on around the world. But then importing what is being done outside won't necessarily solve our problems. As Agnes said, we have a different set of features. We need to understand what makes sense to us and what doesn't. And finally, if we can achieve all of these things, and this is a great challenge, we could play an active role in producing knowledge and technology and exporting this to the rest of the world, not only importing or exporting just agricultural commodities. This is my dream for Brazil, and for everyone who are now listening to us. If you participate in this effort, I think this is possible and great. Maybe Soriano wants to say something. Soriano? I have two things to say. Before, just one thing, can you please be brief as we can listen to other people, Renato and Simon. As I expected, as we have great speakers, we're short of time, okay? So maybe we can be a little faster now, a little briefer. As for minerals, there's one important point. We now call them strategic minerals, and Europe calls critical minerals. In other words, minerals for technology. technological innovation, not only minerals, but also advanced materials like lithium, niobium. We have a large program doing this. We're investing in adding value to these minerals, including graphite, niobium, lithium. There are other important minerals too. And in the energy transition, we should look at them from a different perspective, like cobalt, which is critical. Traditional cobalt mines, they're lagging behind. They use labor that is not necessarily in regular employment conditions, and the ministry is working hard to add all these materials to the mix appropriately. And finally, what you said about Brazil, how can Brazil lead? This, we have a very short answer, biofuels, but I'd like to think more broadly on biofuels. We have synthetic renewable fuels, for instance, biomass carbon capture, which was mentioned too, storage, hydrogen technologies that are also crucial for advanced fuels, and not necessarily biofuels or the bio route, if you will. People are now discussing HVO or the green diesel. In other words, we have many options. Brazil should not be considered as the only participating in biofuels alone. We have also advanced research on advanced batteries using niobium and graphene to reduce load time, include energy density, and so on. That was a general comment. Thank you. I'm trying to, not exceed my time. Thank you, Soriano. Thank you so much. Sorry. The role of moderators is really to ask people to be brief. Now I have a question for Barbara that Barbara asked to Renato. So Renato, Barbara asked, and this is, I think, a question I would ask you too. So at CPFL, how do you evaluate the results of the your learning resources? Maybe some landmarks, if you use patents or publications. What are the major indicators you use to monitor your R&D program? How do you monitor your R&D projects? This issue is very interesting and very specific. It's not exactly easy to generalize this. So every company has a different set of indicators that are most appropriate to them. And this is what Barbara asked. So can you answer this question to us? Okay. I think I should, right? Well, so how do we evaluate innovation with a focus on R&D? First, direct implementation. Energy distributors, well, when you consider the entire energy chain, we're not equipment manufacturers, we're just service providers. So our innovation includes systems, software, tools that help us better manage the entire grid, the implementation of new equipment. The electric sector is highly reliable. So we need to make sure everything is highly reliable when we're developing a new system, a new piece of equipment. And this is one first indicator is whether application has been effective, if it's been developed and integrated into the system. I mentioned preventive maintenance of wind power structures, and also weather forecast and the sending of teams. We also have self-healing programs, smart grid programs to manage and follow up what's taking place in all units. So this is a first indicator. Number two,
patents. We have patents, national and international patents. We also have royalties received from projects we've developed in the past. So we evaluate these as the two key indicators. We also look at qualification and training for our own teams. It's very common for our professionals to write theses, and we also have students participating in our projects and through partnerships we have with universities. One last point I'd like to raise is we have projects with startups. We have 4 examples of startup companies that went through our research and development process, and we developed solutions together, and 3 of them have been receiving funds from investment funds. So these are means that we look at to measure the benefits of the program. And of course, there's always room for improvement. CPFL understands how serious and important it is to use these resources. And of course, there's also room for optimization as well. Last year, at ANEEL, the National Energy Agency, we had discussions on how to improve this program. And one point raised by several agents was private agents react to stimulus. And that's something that was said in public debate. And we understood that the program still had a bias that not always gears it towards applied solutions to the market. So how do we optimize it? We can't really just turn our back to it. We need basic academic research, but also how do we not lose sight of the practical application of these findings? But this is so this is how we manage the resources for this program, and we understand we are yielding very good and positive results. Perfect. Thank you very much. And since Barbara brought it up, it's also a question that comes from a professor to Simon that has a lot to do with this. How does IEA work with innovation metrics? That is, how do you propose to monitor innovation, and how what kind of critical indicators do you work with? Can you comment on that, Simon?
Yes, Gustavo, I'll comment, and I'll do it as quickly as possible. I don't want to make your job any more difficult. Firstly, one thing, I'm going to say 3 things. One thing, on critical materials, it's a very important topic, and the IEA is going to publish a report on this next year. Second thing, we have said in our report, we continue to press the point that government is central to clean energy innovation for a variety of reasons, including, as Renato just said, incentivizing the private sector, but also putting in public funds as well. We don't have currently enough data on the public spending, but we also don't have enough data on the outcome and output indicators around this problem. Something that is very encouraging is that more and more governments are asking this question. We're in more and more discussions about how do you evaluate policy and innovation progress. We're clearly at a time when governments want to improve the efficiency of what they're doing, experiment with new instruments, and track progress. So this brings us to the question about indicators, and I'm very pleased to say that we've been thinking about this quite a bit this year, and we actually have a report that's just gone to editing that will lay out the options for governments and also the private sector to use indicators to track innovation. We're at a stage, I think, with this piece of work where there's a lot of options on the table. There's clearly some metrics that can deliver very quick value, some easy wins, and there are others that you need to put in place time and effort to be able to collect the data and to compare it internationally. And so that will be coming out in November, we hope. And that should lay out some of the IEA's views on this. At the moment, we're really just looking at private sector funding, public sector funding, venture capital deals, and patenting. And then the third point I wanted to finish with was really just a thank you to everybody for all of the great insights, and to say that we look forward to continuing to collaborate on this important topic.
Obrigado, Simon.
Thank you, Simon. About what you said about monitoring investments in research and development is very interesting indeed. And the Big Push event that I mentioned is actually a project, and we're holding an event for it on the 23rd. And we have explored an international classification of investments in research and development in line with IEA manuals and guides, so as to allow the comparison, international comparison, so that we can find new partnership opportunities. If you're interested, I'd like to stress my invitation for the 23rd event. It's also organized by the IEA and other organizations and agencies that play a key role, along with the Ministry of Mines and Energy and Science and Technology. And we've all been trying to establish a database that's more comparable internationally speaking. In Brazil, we also have other ongoing efforts. Recently, there was a publication about research and development resources allocated within ANEEL, the National Energy Agency. So this kind of information is interesting and relevant to a lot of our audience here. That's why I'm stressing the invitation. But because we are exceeding our time, I'd like to just wrap it up. So first of all, I apologize to those who have submitted their questions and we were not able to direct them live because we were indeed short of time and we can't always cover all of the questions. But I think it's important to have a moment for each of our panelists to make their final remarks about what has been discussed in the event and the key points, and perhaps conveying a message they haven't had the opportunity to do before. I just ask you to be very brief so that we don't spend more than 2 or 3 minutes on each one of you. I'd like to start with Rafaela. Thank you, Gustavo. Well, I wasn't expecting it. Well, I just wanted to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this type of panel with this quality of high-level speakers. And I think the energy and the electricity sectors will globally go through deep changes that will require a coordinated effort and an accelerated effort, as Timur has brought up. And that's going to be necessary from all parts of society. Every dime will count, right? So we must guarantee that the effort is being made and that innovation will be crucial for us to develop a few aspects of this energy transition, and we must be able to gather all the public and the private sector, governments, the academy, and startup companies. They're all important because it's a big challenge indeed. That's all I had to say. Thank you. Thank you, Rafaela. I now hand it over to Renato. First, the private sector, right? Then the public sector. Thank you. I will be brief. I'd like to, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to participate. And I think the event's agenda is reflecting the current moment. First of all, we have a big challenge at a global level to reduce emissions. That's a challenge for mankind, humankind as a whole. Then we have the planning aspect, which we will need a lot of, and then the cooperation between public and private sector agents. I'm sure it wasn't a coincidence how this event was organized. It really does reflect the size of a challenge we have to face and how important it is to work in partnerships. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you, Renato. Simon, any final remarks?
Yeah, I'll say one thing, because I already thought this was complete. You mentioned, Gustavo, the Big Push event, and I would strongly recommend to everybody to join that event on the 23rd, and it will talk about this issue of data collection. And data is important for informing prioritization of technologies, for understanding what is important in the local Brazilian context, and for evaluating and monitoring what happens and benchmarking internationally. And our involvement in that piece of work and our understanding of what Brazil hopes to achieve with the data work that Tiago mentioned earlier in this area, we think that actually this would put Brazil right at the very top in terms of global best practice on data monitoring for clean energy innovation. So I really strongly encourage that piece of work. And there are other countries will be looking to learn from you.
Thank you, Simon. Soriano, por favor.
Thank you, Simon. Now, Soriano, do you have any final remarks? First of all, I'd like to thank MME, EPE, and IEA for the kind invitation. I would just like to briefly go through a few points. First of all, the MME has its toolbox ready for use. The last tools are just coming out this month or next month. And secondly, we have to discuss the enabling technologies in Brazil. We have to structure that well in Brazil. But it's not just about discussing them, but rather it's about applying them. And for that matter, we need partnerships, and perhaps some of these tools in our toolbox must be customized for the energy sector. And this is something that's definitely coming out of the governance debate going on at MME. And that's basically it. The ministry is at your disposal. We understand we must invest heavily on this, and I would like to stress it's extremely important to have these partnerships, these international partnerships, and that Brazil is not seen just as biofuel. We have a set of technologies that Brazil could lead or contribute with in the international effort for the energy transition. And perhaps we could create new models for energy sectors where technologies will play an important role. I'd like to thank you on behalf of Minister Marcos Pontes. And I'd just like to emphasize another point, which is this year, for the first time, we have the Science and Technology Month, the celebratory month, where we will have several events. It's not just a week anymore. So thank you very much on behalf of the ministry. Thank you very much, Soriano. Now to wrap it up with the panelists, Agnes, please, your final remarks. Hi, Gustavo. I'm just thinking what to say here, because at the end, all this debate brought up so many important reflections. And I think the biggest takeaway to me is, what is the role played by the state? I see that deep down, we are looking at things from a perspective of creating clearer and better defined rules for investment and allow innovation to come from the private sector to eliminate bottlenecks. But when we're talking about prioritizing, we must look at it from a more strategic point of view. In terms of country, where do we stand? And we must listen to society and investors who are placing their chips on Brazil, and also looking at the international scenario and challenges such as decarbonizing. And that leads me to think, well, when I studied economy back in the 1990s, there was a whole discussion about industrial policy. And when we talk about reducing the role played by the state, at the time, we thought that's something we must do. But there's still a challenge for certain industries to go through their energy transition. And perhaps we must, as a government, look at more at these industries. And even though the rest of the world is not making a lot of progress in that sense, like Rafaela said, we could lead that. And I think it's an internal discussion about our industries and what else we could be doing. But these are just my personal takeaways from this discussion. I think it was a very rich debate, and we must build things together. I'm very pleased to participate. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm at your disposal for future debates as well. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you, Agnes. I'd like to thank all of you for your availability, for your time and care. The event is not just what's happening live. We talk a lot before the event, and the entire process was very productive for us panelists too, because like Agnes said, innovation has lots of dimensions, and we must face these challenges. When we look at one aspect, we are leaving out several other players that were important to make things happen. We are aware of this, and we suffer with this too, because we would like to hold an event that could actually hold people's attention for a longer period or throughout its entire duration, and we must make choices for that matter, right? But I think what's most important is that energy transition is all about energy and innovation, and the goals proposed for decarbonizing the industry, for instance, will necessarily go through a process where they will get more relevant in several sectors and several industries. And I believe we managed to cover the perspectives of two very important sectors in the Brazilian context, which is biofuel and bioelectricity, and also to bring the government into a discussion for improving governance and interactions between the ministries that share these challenges. So I'm personally very happy to participate in this debate. I'd like to thank you once again for your patience, for your time. And I give the floor back to Camilla, so she wraps up the event.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, all panelists, for an excellent debate. So this is the end of our meeting. And I think we have highlighted the importance of innovation for energy transition and for Brazil to maximize the benefits of this process, not only in terms of competitiveness, being more competitive, and also for its economic development. This conference will be available on the website of the IEA. On the 23rd of October, we'll have a webinar to launch the Big Push reports. So we will provide data and evidence based on indicators. And as Agnes said, and Soriano, the toolbox in itself is not enough. So we will also be analyzing public policies, lines of action, and also the importance of prioritizing and also having public policy